Great. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Cicero Group. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ian Anderson, Chairman here at Cicero, and we're delighted to be hosting this event for the Institute of Business Ethics this morning. Delighted to have you in the room. For those of you that don't know Cicero, we work a lot with the buy side and inward investors, helping them with the public policy and wider communications conversation. And it seems to me, I was just saying to Peter and Alex before we sat down, that we could literally put this event into our diary on the same day every year, and maybe indeed have the same debate. Well, hopefully we're not going to do that this morning. We're going to have a different kind of debate, but I take one slight issue with the title, Peter, just to sort of get the debate going up front. I can't pronounce remuneration. Maybe I just did. I think I can pronounce the word pay, and I think that's the word that most voters understand. So let's maybe have that debate as we go on, and whether or not pay, executive pay, is fair or unfair is, I say, a question that has been an annual battle. It's been an annual battle before the financial crisis. It was an annual battle through the financial crisis. It's been an annual battle at the other end of the financial crisis, and it seems to be an annual debate into whatever we are currently moving into economically in terms of the global unsettled environment right now. The IBE does make the point that I think that pay is right up there with corporate taxes, and we've had that debate writ large with the Google tax that supposedly doesn't tax Google very much since the start of the year. And today really is the opportunity for Peter and his team, the IBE, to put on the table, I think, a very, very interesting report. Certainly for the folks that we work with, it's a very, very interesting report. I think for those of you that were up early this morning, you'll have heard Peter debating with Anne Richards some of those issues on the Today programme this morning. Do we need a simpler system that everybody, professional investors, those who are receiving these pay awards, and voters too, I'm going to keep saying voters, do they understand what's going on? Is pay still far too short-termist? And are there actually better international models that we can look at, or not? Do we actually do quite well here in the UK? I'd be quite interested to get into some of those questions as we roll out this conversation. So I'm going to ask Peter Montagnon to speak first, and then I'm going to introduce and ask Alex Edmonds to respond to the report. Peter and I have known each other some time, since his FT days, when he was rolling out red tops, when he was at the ABI, and indeed at the FRC as well. So, known to, I think, everybody in this room, Peter Montagnon is now an Associate Director of the Institute of Business Ethics. Peter, over to you to talk about the report.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stay seated, if that's all right, because I'm not quite sure what to do with the microphone if I'm standing behind a steward. I want to begin by saying thank you to Ian and to the Cicero team for the help they've given us in hosting this launch. It's very good to be here. And also to Alex for coming along. Well, I don't know what, Alex, you're going to say about my report, but thank you in advance. That is not too rude. On the other hand, it's a free debate. And also I want to thank my colleagues at the IBE who've been very patient and very helpful. In particular, Joanna Hicks, who's edited this and put it through to the printers. She knows that I'm a rather cantankerous author, and she's always been very patient with me, and I'm grateful for that. And then I want to say also, by way of beginning, that we were really quite nervous about embarking on this project because remuneration is a difficult subject. Ian, you can't say it. I can never type it on a word processor without making a mistake. And maybe we should change the title, but when you talk about pay, of course the other word that is used is compensation, which is the American expression. But I always think that compensation has that element of compensation for damages inflicted on you, which I'm not sure happens very often to American chief executives. It's more likely some compensation is due for damage they may well have inflicted on others, but that's another debate, because this here is about UK remuneration. And it's also, it is difficult, a subject which is difficult to avoid. It consistently comes at or near the top of the list of our surveys about what undermines trust in business. It attracts a very strong focus on the press, in the press, as well as a lot of interest from regulators and policymakers. And it figures very large, and some people would say too large, in the general debate about corporate governance. And of course there is also a strong ethical dimension. This is not because we at the IBE have strong opinions about how much executives should be paid, but more because the process of administering remuneration can never be formulaic. It requires decisions, and our view is that those decisions will be better if they are informed by ethical values, in this case principally fairness and transparency. So this briefing is not a polemic or the start of a determined campaign by the IBE for reform. It starts with the acknowledgement that the present system is not working very well, and sets out to ask, helpfully I hope, both how it could be made to work better, with or without the radical reform that some would urge. It's driven by a belief that remuneration should not be so complicated that very few people, including often the executives in receipt of it, can really understand the value of what they're receiving. Also, remuneration should be fair and be seen to be fair. And I want to stress here that this does not mean scaling everybody back. Good chief executives deserve high reward. It's the underachievers and those whose apparent triumphs fail to endure who do not. Now, my own view is that a poor record on remuneration is also a symptom of broader problems with governance, culture and corporate strategy. And I want to say at the outset also that this is a very difficult subject for those involved to get right. And my long experience going back into my ABI days of dealing with them is that the vast majority of people who sit on remuneration committees do actually want to do the right thing. But it is, we have to acknowledge, very difficult. And if the task were that easy, I would put it to you that a Labour government, which owned 83% of the Royal Bank of Scotland, would have been able to deal decisively with bankers' bonuses. The fact that they didn't is an indication of just how difficult the subject really is. Unlike the government in those days, boards and shareholders are caught in advice. Sorry, caught in advice, not caught in advice. You see, I can't even type my English. They have to acknowledge that good chief executives do not come cheap. Yet there is a large reputational risk in overpaying and a strategic risk in getting the incentives wrong. What will happen if the Remuneration Committee refuse to meet the demands of a strong-willed and currently very successful chief executive? Will he or she walk? And what will happen to the company and share price if that turns out to be the case? All of this requires judgment. And into those judgments goes a lot less pure greed than many outsiders believe, and a lot more risk aversion. Set against the overall cost of doing business, top executive pay is actually relatively trivial for most companies. Why risk the ship for a hateful tar, as the old saying goes? And yet, we've seen how excess and perception of excess damages the reputation of business. In the extreme, it hurts staff morale, adds to customer dissatisfaction, and makes companies much more vulnerable to regulatory intervention. Sometimes one comes across executives and directors who are so battle-scarred that they profess no longer to care about public opinion, or who think that public concern will evaporate when the next boom comes along. But there are plenty of others these days who worry privately that the process is broken. Performance conditions that we're used to do not really work. Bonuses stay high, however well the company is doing. It's not clear that the incentives within the system really do motivate people to take good decisions in the long-term interest of the company and its shareholders. Now, this briefing makes 4 core points. First, it is very hard to believe that even people directly involved in the process of settling pay really know the value of what is being handed over. One cannot simply add everything up, as the government regulations now require, and come up with a single figure, because the regulations mix up the outcome of awards which were made in previous years with cash and bonus received in the current year. The real answer to the single figure ought to be the net present value of everything an executive receives in the year in question. Yet experience shows that it is well nigh impossible to calculate the net present value of today's long-term share schemes or even of bonuses with a deferred element. Moreover, these schemes are capable of producing such a wide range of different outcomes that what does get made over at the end of the day seems quite often little more than arbitrary. So it's long seemed odd to me that we have a system where neither those who make the awards nor those who receive them can easily value what's entailed, and that then we entrust shareholders who are one further removed the task of policing the process through their vote. Now, shareholders do have an interest and indeed a responsibility as part of their stewardship obligation to oversee remuneration. But it's hard for them to do this unless they're being asked to judge something that they can be reasonably expected to understand and evaluate. This brings me on to the second point. With a fair wind behind him or her, the chief executive of a large company these days can make enough money in 3 years to set themselves, their children and their grandchildren up for life. No wonder they're keen to do all in their power to ensure that their scheme's best, whether this is good for the company in the long term or not. By contrast, if the stock market and the economy do not oblige, the outcome can be very disappointing. The difference between the two extremes is large, too large for comfort. The problem, in other words, and I think this to me was one of the important understandings I got while preparing this paper. The problem is not just the amount that executives receive, it's the speed in which they can earn it or fail to do so, the way it is handed over, and the impact this has on behaviour. Now, we need variable pay, but we also need some more consistency in outcome, and we need to stop fixating on performance targets that do not necessarily work, or believing that giving people leveraged share schemes aligns their interests with other long-term shareholders, because it doesn't necessarily do that. My personal view, and this is reflected in this report, there's not a sort of campaign from the IBE, is that a simpler approach would be to rely much more heavily on cash, because we can all see how much that is worth when it's handed over. We could then require executives to use some of that cash to buy shares in the company and hold them for a long time, much longer than the present norm of 3 to 5 years of contemporary, which is what you find in contemporary share schemes. That would have one other important consequence, which is essentially the third point in this report, that executives would have a strong interest in succession planning, because since they were continuing to hold shares, they would not want the company to collapse as soon as they're gone. Indeed, their whole outlook would become more long-term, but the succession planning point is an important one, I believe. While it's often right for companies to hire new executives from outside, it's not always the case that this is a thought-through and planned decision. It may arise also because the strategy endorsed by the board has turned out to be flawed. Boards which take succession planning seriously at least have a choice when it comes to replacing their chief executives. Those who end up denying themselves this choice often have to play over the odds. And now, of course, it's very easy for me to stand here and theorise. One can't simply wave a magic wand and make everything all right in an instant. Reforming the system would require consensus and a lot of hard work. In the meantime, we hope that some of these principles, which we've set out in this briefing, can help remuneration committees work better within the system. This means testing schemes for simplicity and fairness, trying to avoid extreme outcomes, and paying attention to succession planning. And all of this also means exercising judgment, and this is my fourth point. Remuneration committees cannot avoid the need to exercise judgment, and judgment is, of course, where the ethics come in. The most important judgment they have to make is how much they should pay, still how much they should pay. Reading remuneration reports is striking for one thing, which is that they rarely tell you why the quantum was chosen in the first place. They tell you a lot about how the outcomes arose and about some of the conditionality. They do not tell you why the on-target quantum is 4 million rather than 2 million or 6 million. The assumption is that it is simply the going rate for the job. But remuneration committees need to have a better idea of where they stand than this. What are their own ideas of limits? Where do they feel it's right to draw the line? Can they justify why they've chosen a given amount? If they can, and that justification is convincing even though the amount is large, trust will flow back. If they can't, they will be accused of weakness. I said at the beginning that this is not easy. None of what is in this report is intended to take a general swipe at remuneration committees. It is more intended to help them, perhaps the newer ones especially, to get to grips with a very difficult task. We need them to succeed because if they do, their companies will be better and business as a whole will enjoy a better reputation. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very, very much indeed. A very, very comprehensive set of thoughts there, and a very interesting framework for this debate and for our discussion this morning. So next up to respond to this conversation, I'm delighted to have Alex Edmonds with us. For those of you like me that are avid Twitter followers, Alex is a digital academic as well as being an academic. He is very, very, very much out there in terms of the debate, and that's something that I love to see. He's Professor of Finance at London Business School, moved there from Wharton Business School before that. The latest MBA class at London Business School has ranked him as the highest rated professor. For any of you that have seen him before, either at Davos or on TEDx, there's a theme running here, isn't there? You'll know why. To respond to executive remuneration, fair or unfair, Alex Edmonds.
Well, thank you very much, Ian and Peter, for the invitation to be here, and thank you to you all for attending. So it's a huge pleasure to give my views on this report, and let me say from the outset that I completely agree with the goal of the report, which is to move compensation schemes towards better ones that will incentivise CEOs to take actions in the long-term interest of both shareholders and society. And I also agree with much of the actual content of the report as well. But what I want to try to do, as much as possible in this response, is to be as contrarian as possible, because it's easy sort of to say I agree with the report, which I do, but in order to spark conversation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the points of the report in which I have somewhat of a different view, but again, this is with the spirit of just encouraging debate rather than having different goals. And indeed, while my views may be different, in many cases my views may be incorrect, and you may actually agree with what was stated in the report rather than my own views. So the reason for me stating these somewhat different views is just to spark conversation, and hopefully this might lead to an even stronger report, and therefore some things will be done about it, because as was mentioned by Ian, we might be having the same conversation every year, so this would lead to, I think, a more powerful report, and then hopefully something which is more effective. So let me start by just telling you about my general approach to these things, and sort of why you might have an academic responding rather than a practitioner who's much closer to these decisions. So what we see in reality is we see many examples which suggest that the current system is broken and it must be fixed. So as Peter quite eloquently said, there's cases in which there's high pay despite low performance, right? We don't begrudge high compensation if it's actually earned, but there's many cases where despite failing, the CEO has walked off with quite a lot of money. And this leads to us thinking the system is broken, it's not working, it should be fixed. But my first point, which is the second sub-bullet, is that as policymakers or practitioners or investors or the media, I think our first view would be similar to the Hippocratic Oath for a doctor, which is first do no harm. So in some cases, it may well be that some of the proposed solutions may cause greater problems than the problems they're trying to solve to begin with. So before we actually look to reform, we must actually look, well, is this a problem which is widespread? Right? We know of a few examples which are very high profile of pay despite bad performance, but is it a few bad apples, or is the entire cart rotten? Because this will affect how widespread the reforms we want to undertake must be. If it's just a few bad examples, let's just tackle, spot check those two examples rather than changing the entire system. I think this is where academic research can come in, because while I'm clearly not as close to companies as many of you, you will know much more about a particular company than me. What we do is we'll study hundreds of companies in different countries and at different time periods to try to get a general viewpoint, because the media will obviously focus on the high profile examples of failure. You'll never have a news story saying London Bridge did not collapse today. Right? That's not a newsworthy article. Right? If something bad happens, that will be reported. Similarly, there might be many cases in which pay was deserved and this is not being brought to our attention. So what I'm always trying to do in my responses is to try to ask, where is the evidence? Now, I'm trying to look at the evidence with humility, because I understand this is not science, right? We can't control carbon-14 atoms and keep everything else constant. So the evidence is only suggestive, but to the extent to which there is evidence, I believe it can inform the views that we have. And just two small bits of anecdotes as to the importance of evidence. I see it's not stated in the report, but stated elsewhere, many arguments that pay was responsible for the financial crisis. It was executives who knowingly took bad decisions because their pay schemes rewarded them for risk-taking. And to my knowledge, there's no convincing evidence that pay had a causal effect on the crisis. The crisis was clearly very bad, but it's not clear that pay led to this. For example, the CEO of Bear Stearns, he lost $900 million from the Bear Stearns collapse, so it's not necessarily the case that he benefited from this. One thing which was stated in the report was this oft-quoted statement by John Klein of Deutsche. He said, "I promise you I will not work any harder or any less hard because someone is going to pay me more or less." So that makes suggest just scrap incentive pay, have a flat salary. But here this is somewhat problematic because this is a very selective quote and it's unverifiable. Obviously you do want to say stuff like that. There may well be other executives for which incentives do matter, but it's less likely that they are going to come out and say something like this, so we don't want to form policy too much based on one. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to tackle three, first like sort of the general approach to the article before I talk about some of the specifics. So the article is titled Fair or Unfair. However, I didn't really see in the paper an explicit definition of fair, what fair means, and I think that maybe the report would be bolstered by just stating what do we mean by fair so that everybody's on the same page to begin with. It does hint at fairness in many of the statements that are made. The closest I could find was of page 7, which is fairness means rewarding real contribution. Again, as Peter said, we want to reward success, and no one begrudges that, not rewarding failure. Now, I agree with this point, but then if we agree that the correct determinant of pay is the contribution of the executive, then this means that other things don't matter. So one thing which is said to be relevant is the pay of the median employee. And so there's some arguments that we want to keep this ratio within some certain bound. But indeed, if the executive creates a lot of value, then she should be paid for the value that she's created, potentially irrespective of the pay of the median employee. Because certainly if things go badly, what we'd like under the optimal scheme is the executive's pay to fall substantially, but not the pay of the median employee to fall substantially. So it's not clear that these two things are linked. So if indeed you do believe that what matters is real contribution, and I agree with you, then this is quite profound, because this suggests that actually many of the things that people focus on, like these pay ratios, are not as important as pay for performance. Also, I think it would be useful if the paper justified why fairness is the number one consideration for pay. It's called fair or unfair, but it could be called efficient or inefficient, or short-term or long-term. There's many other dimensions. So the paper argues that fairness and simplicity are the two most important themes. They are indeed important, but there might be other things that we want to look at: efficiency, or the incentivization of innovation, or corporate social responsibility, or long-term thing, all of these other things. These may be consistent with fairness in many cases, but there's parts of this which might not be the same as fairness. In particular, a flat salary would be the most simple thing. It might be fair in some cases, but this is not necessarily going to incentivize the best behavior. So I think what would be useful is just an overarching theme, just to argue, well, why is it fair or unfair that we care about? And if we do care about this, just what a clear definition of these are. So next I'm going to tackle three particular dimensions of pay, which people and the report have looked at. Number one, the level of pay, quantum. Number two, the sensitivity of pay to performance. And number three, the structure, whether it's long-term or short-term. So the first part is quantum, and this is something which just provokes the most anger from the general public. And if you just look at the numbers, these look to be extremely provocative, right? The average pay of a FTSE 100 CEO was £5 million in 2014. By anybody's standards, that's a huge amount of money. It's 183 times what a rank and file employee will make. In 2 days, a chief executive will earn as much as a worker will do for the whole year. And this has grown a lot recently, so pay's gone up by about 20% in the last 5 years. Median employee pay has not gone up by the same amount. And so this leads to a number of people just expressing some concerns. So some of you all know this book here, which was not just an academic bestseller, but a New York Times bestseller, arguing that pay is without performance. So the caricature is the CEO sets his own pay, and it's rubber stamped by boards of directors which are either just incompetent because they're not focused, they're sitting on too many boards, or they're perhaps conflicted, they're the friends of the CEO. That is the caricature, and this has had quite a lot of influence. This has led to some changes, particularly in the US. But in reality, this may not actually be the case, and what we can look at, just in terms of casual empiricism, is what happens when a private equity firm takes over a company. Right, private equity firms, they do have incentives to monitor. So it's not that you have loads of shareholders who are dispersed to allow the CEO to get away with paying himself or herself a lot. With private equity, you do find that they do have teeth. Right, they have incentives to set pay optimally. And they do stuff, right? They do kick out CEOs in many cases. So it's not that they're ineffective. But it's very rare that you'll see a private equity firm keep the existing CEO and reduce pay, or change the CEO and reduce pay at the same time. So they'll do things, they'll make a lot of restructurings, but the fact that they don't seem to touch the level of pay may suggest that actually the level of pay is not as egregious as people might think. And if we look at the actual numbers, right, the level of pay is huge compared to rank and file employees, but compared to firm value, and this was something Peter did touch upon in his summary, if we think of £5 million being median pay, the median size of a firm in the FTSE 100 is £7 billion. So this pay is 0.07% of firm value, so it's relatively small. Now that's not to say it's not important, right? A firm can't be blasé about 5 million. And we have to be careful about these arguments, because we could use this to justify any sort of excess, right? You could just divide anything by 7 billion and say, we don't need to keep our flight budgets under control. So I'm not saying that. These are important, but I'd say that there's other dimensions of pay that are more important because they might have percentage point not basis point effects on firm value, and I'm going to look at that shortly. And again, just a high-profile example, Helge Lund, he was given a golden hello initially, 26.5 million, moved to 14. That is, again, extremely large. If we look at how much value the Royal Dutch Shell takeover created, it was £8.4 billion. Now, clearly this wasn't all down to him, and it may well have happened anyway. Let's say, to be conservative, only 0.5% of that value creation was down to him. That is still £42 million, so it's not necessarily true or not automatic that this pay was actually excessive compared to value that he might have created. Again, it's not entirely down to him, but even if we take just, say, a small slither was down to him, that might justify a relatively high amount of pay. But instead what I want to focus more on is sensitivity. So as I mentioned, quantum is very small compared to firm value, but sensitivity, this is where we can have large effect in firm value. And I agree completely with Peter in his concern for bonuses. That bonuses, they're often given for on-target performance. Right? Why do you get a bonus for just doing your job? And often bonuses are not cut if performance is bad. For example, KPMG found that 8% of FTSE 350 companies received zero bonus. When if you think, well, a bonus should be taken away for below median performance, that should be closer to 50%. However, I would argue that even though bonuses might be relatively inflexible, this doesn't mean that the CEO doesn't have any incentives at all. In particular, most of your incentives come not from the bonus, but the change in the previously granted stock and options that you were given in the past. So let's take the former late Steve Jobs. He got $1 a year for Apple, regardless of performance. Does this mean he didn't care about performance? No, because he had so much stock in Apple that he was very sensitive to the fortunes of Apple. So what we want to look at is not pay performance sensitivity, how much your level of pay changes year to year depending on performance, which is indeed pretty low, but wealth performance sensitivity, so how much your entire wealth, including all of your previously accumulated stock and options, changes with performance. And this is actually quite large. So this recent survey found that CEOs in the US lose £500,000 for a 1 percentage point loss in firm value, which are relatively large amounts. Okay. So just on this point, now let's look at some evidence, and this was a paper published in the Journal of Finance, which is the leading finance journal, by two relatively unknown people, and so they managed to get it into the top journal because, I believe, of the strength of this study. And just back to Ian's point on my digital aspects, one of the things I'm really passionate about is trying to get complex finance concepts across in simple language for the general public. And so I have a blog called Access to Finance, which is something I aim to do this, and I just blogged about this paper a few days ago. So if you'd like to learn more, the paper itself is butch and barbaric because it's written for academics, but hopefully the summary that I wrote is much more simple. And what it looks not at the level of pay, but it looks at, let's look at the sensitivity of pay to performance. How much skin in the game does the CEO have? They found that firms in which CEOs have a lot of equity in her own firm, they outperform those where the CEO does not care about performance by 4 to 10% per year, which is a large amount. Now, as we know, correlation does not imply causation, right? CEO owns a lot of stocks, firm performance is good.